We are talking today with Carole Caroompas, longtime Los Angeles-based painter, performance artist, and art educator. Carole, tell us about rock and roll. What does it represent to you both as a working material and as subject matter?
I think thematically, it's like I love going to concerts. I love music, and not just rock and roll music. I sort of cross over into eclectic stuff too. But I think where it sort of enters into my work is that I've for many years used elements of male-female relationships and sex and gender and the body.
Yes.
And then I think key within all of this is the element of desire.
Desire.
And rock and roll is, the person on stage is a vessel of desire.
Aha. A lot of your work, well, each series is based on historical literary references, essentially.
Yeah, yeah.
For example, one series is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It was a jumping off point. Is that what the texts are? Are they jumping off points? Do they serve as an analog to content, or both?
Actually both, but I think with my work I've always started from a language base. So whatever subject I've sort of chosen to work with, and the sort of overall theme or title of the series, from there I usually come up with all the titles of the work. And then I only work on one piece at a time, and then I bounce off of that title. So
the title is always previous to the...
Language always has been.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's hugely interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
And then the images are chosen in terms of how the language directs them towards the content, which a lot of artists don't do that. They start from the visuals, or they start from like instinct, or it's very laid out, and I do a lot of research and a lot of reading before I do anything.
Does language then function as a semiological? Is it linguistic interpretation, or it's symbolic meaning? A phrase or a title has symbolic meaning that resonates for you?
It's actually both, and it's also when I pick text as a source, I usually will pick text that most people have a reference to. They already have a thought about what it is. So it's rare that I will, pick some really obscure text. Yeah. But then again, like someone like Virginia Woolf, I'm assuming that one knows who Virginia Woolf is. So, then there's also like, I did a series of fairy tales.
Right.
And everyone, has some kind of like contact with a fairy tale and what Little Red Riding Hood means.
Sure.
Frankenstein, I think, is sort of the same thing. I did another series of Hester and Zorro in Quest of a New World. Hester being the Scarlet Letter, which most people know.
Right.
And Zorro, everybody knows. And then, Wuthering Heights is pretty well known. Also, a lot of the things that I pick have also been referenced through film.
In film?
Yeah, and that's also very important, because in terms of how I work with a fragmented narrative, the cinematic quality is definitely there. But it's like it's being cut and edited all the time.
On the surface of the painting.
On the surface of the painting, yeah.
A lot of your work has to do with the eternal battle of the sexes, in a way. It's a recurring theme, certainly, in your work.
Yeah. I'm smiling because the kitties are making noise. Trucks go by, cars go by, kitties go by.
Is the work intended to be instructive, or to further asking questions about gender and
romance and desire?
Romance and desire, and is there ever an answer to that?
If there is, I don't know it. And if I knew it, I'd probably be making a huge amount of money. I'm not, in the sense of the work being didactic and kind of finger wagging, it is not that at all.
Yeah, I don't think it is. I think it asks a lot of questions.
It's very much about bringing up questions surrounding relationships, past and present, and how culture and how myth affects belief systems of how people actually orient themselves in terms of how they deal with relationships and how they deal with sexuality and how they deal with issues of the body and gender.
The archetype of the outsider appears a lot in your work. Heathcliff, Frankenstein.
Frankenstein is an outsider.
I think so. Am I correct in thinking that this is an archetype that reappears in your work?
Yeah, I guess so. Actually, I hadn't really thought about that, but it's sort of, it appears in my life.
How?
I don't know. How does it appear? I don't know. My mother's always teased me about this. She said if there's an underdog in the room, that's who you'll want to talk to.
Right.
And especially if it's a guy.
Right.
You know, it's sort of like the whole outsider theme. But that ties into, you know, your original question about rock and roll.
Right.
And I think it also ties into the kind of art that I make and the kind of images I choose and what I'm talking about, because a lot of the times the things that I like to address aren't necessarily pleasant or comfortable subjects, but that's what makes them interesting.
Do you think it's sort of a renegade approach to be making paintings at this time in history?
Well, poor painting.
Yeah,
you know?
Let's talk about that.
Poor painting. It goes through, every 10 years, painting is dead.
Right.
You know, and then it raises its ugly head and comes back again, and people re-embrace it. And I think because of, you know, the tremendous amount of history behind painting, that it's always seemingly somehow dried up and then becomes reinvented, or historically things are retwisted, and so I guess in a sense, you know, painting's always tottering between being a renegade and being, you know, an old-fashioned approach to art making. I think it's probably both. I mean, what's interesting to me about painting is that it does have such an enormous amount of history, and it complicates the matter, and it complicates the act of making a painting. It's harder, but that's interesting, I think.
Absolutely.
You know?
And it gives rise to true quality.
On occasion.
On occasion.
Yeah.
So you'll always paint?
Well, I have for a really long time. Yeah.
And in terms of...
I'd like to sing again, too.
I think you should sing again. I mean...
Obviously, I've lost my voice in the last week, so I normally don't sound like this. But, yeah, I think I will probably always paint, and I will probably always sing in some form, and probably write. Those things are interesting to me.
How does feminism influence, guide, direct your work? Does it?
Yeah, I think it's definitely part of the work. I mean, I came out of that in terms of when I was in graduate school and first out of graduate school. I was in a consciousness raising group with Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro and
oh my gosh,
Karen Carson, And I was the youngest one, and I was doing really formal installation work at that time, so I got beat up a lot.
Why? What did they say?
Because my work was so very formal, and modernism is always associated with the male gender.
Is that your take on it?
No.
Yeah.
You know, and then I guess within that same time period, I started doing work that was still using very formalist structure, but I was using glitter.
Yes.
And veiling from women's hats and feathers.
Feathers.
Elements from party stores like Glow Culture.
Tissue paper.
Yeah. And things that referenced either low culture or domesticity.
Yeah.
So I think that idea of sort of modernist structure and how you use materials or images can really be kind of filtered, and a different voice comes from it. And my work still, in terms of composition and layout, is very, very structured.
Well, the grid certainly is a huge part of your work.
Modernism at its male best.
In the last few years in the work, you've been introducing found embroideries into the work. Is that a reintroduction of, again, the grid and the work of the 70s? The stuff that you were doing in the 70s? Or is it something that you find and you know it has to be in a painting? You know that it sings true to that initial title or line of text that you're jumping off from?
Well, again, it's sort of both.
Yeah.
But I mean, my early work was very collage based and painted, and then that collage was introduced into the use of just working with paintings, or just with paint itself. But the collage element was an important factor in terms of the composition. And also that I use different kinds of techniques in the painting.
Right.
And then when I started working on the series Hester and Zorro in Quest of a New World, the idea of domesticity and embroidery is very much of, and the Scarlet Letter was part of the Scarlet Letter.
Perfect.
So the first use of embroideries in the paintings were painted. And then as I went through the series, I decided that I should actually be using the embroideries themselves. So the embroideries are laminated on canvas and or panels, and then I paint on those and integrate the embroidery so that it becomes like another painting technique.
I see.
So with Hester and the Scarlet Letter, it also becomes symbolic. It refers to domesticity. It refers to women's work. Embroidery has always been thought of as a secondary craft, not a real fine art. You know, and then we're also taking back from the 70s again, where pattern and decoration, women's work is brought in as a medium.
Can we talk about the drawing, mapping sort of process that occurs when you're constructing a painting? I know that you tirelessly do a lot of drawing before you go to the painting. What's the process about?
Well, as I said before, first I start with language.
Right.
For subject, come up with a list of titles, etc. And then I do a lot of reading and writing and gathering of research information, images, do a lot of sketches. And then when I come up with the images that I know that I want to do, I used to do them smaller and then blow them up with the grid, and now I usually do them just to scale.
I see.
So I do line drawings on tracing paper of the images to scale. So this entire painting, what's happening here, would all be done on tracing paper, pencil, line drawings.
Wow.
And then that's transferred to the painting, and then I start the painting. But I probably spend way too much time on the drawing.
How much time do you spend?
Oh, weeks.
Weeks on the drawing?
Yeah. A couple of paintings before this one, oh gosh, that painting must have been 8 or 9 feet tall, and it had a patterned background in it of old wallpaper of swans.
I remember this painting, yeah.
Yeah, of the swans and the flowers. And I show at Mark Moore Gallery, and Cliff Benjamin, who's the director over there, came over to see how the painting was coming along, and he looked at the drawing and he was like, "Are you crazy?" And I used to just, I'd spend weeks and weeks and weeks on these drawings, and I used to like throw them away, and Cliff was like, "You have to keep these,
yeah, you should.
This is crazy." But there's something about the process, it's almost like getting to know a person. Through the act of the writing and then the drawing, I have so many conversations before I've even started the painting that I really kind of, I know the painting. It's like I haven't just been introduced to it, I really have established a relationship with it. And the writing and the drawing really allows that. A lot of decision making when I'm doing the drawing in terms of color, in terms of composition, technique, how I'm going to paint a certain kind of image, etc., really comes into place when I'm doing the drawing. And not a huge amount of changes happen once I start the painting. I mean, things do alter and change in terms of maybe technique or use of color, but a lot of that decision making comes from doing the drawing.
There's a fluid grace and astounding beauty to your work that is counterbalanced with some wonderfully difficult and in-your-face explicit subject matter. What does the dichotomy of form and content represent to you?
I really like using those things together. That they create a clash. They also create a fissure that opens up other information when those things are collapsed together.
What type of information? What types of information, rather?
Well, for instance, like this painting isn't finished.
Okay.
This is a painting in progress. It's not done yet. But for instance, like in this painting where I'm using these embroideries that I got in Oaxaca last summer, and they're embroideries. They're pre-embroidery, really, because they haven't been embroidered yet.
Oh.
They are just the silk screen.
It's like an outline.
It's the outline. It's like the imprint. And they have really sweet messages on them, like the bird, and it says "por nuestro amor," for our love. Or this one has the two birds in the heart. "Tuyo es mi corazón." You are my heart.
Oh my gosh.
You are my love. And then several of them are, the virgins, or the cute little girl with the flowers, or the heart, or even the donkey. "Aquí está tu taxi." Here's your taxi.
Oh.
And then they're layered with these images of these women from the LA Weekly ads. They're the sex ads.
I see.
So you take something from a culture that's very sweet and has a certain kind of meaning to it, whether it's the love of the Virgin of Guadalupe or, the love of the heart, and then you lay these ladies on top of them with these quotes, "Up late, can't sleep," or "XXX porn princess," and the information starts to collapse into something else. And that's really interesting to me. And also that these imprints of the embroideries also start, when they're layered onto the women, become like tattoo marks. And that the piece is called "Blue Impressions Are Left on Her Colorless Skin."
Oh my gosh.
Can reference to the tattoo. It can also reference to a black and blue mark.
Right.
Or it can reference to a vein. Different bodily references come up with that. It can reference violence. But because that quote comes from Wuthering Heights, I think there's also a certain poetic to it also. So it's like the sort of the sweet and the dark commingle and are constantly merging with each other, and I think that's sort of how it is anyway.
Do you think there's more darkness than light, or is it the moments of beauty are what one searches, or is it you have to go through the darkness to get to the light, all of that, all these cliches of...
Yeah, I basically am a hopeful person.
Yeah.
So I think they coexist, and I think sometimes the dark wins and sometimes the light wins.
Sure. And that's all right.
And also, I think that there can be a certain beauty and a certain poetry to the darkness too.
Absolutely.
Because it gives you an understanding to appreciate the other. For better or worse.
What's the next series? What's the next?
I have not a clue.
Maybe music.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I honestly, the one thing I was kind of thinking about is, you know how pop songs are always thought of as 3-minute songs?
Right.
I could make my 3-minute paintings. Or somehow the idea of that could come in there, but I honestly don't know. Once this painting is done, I'm going to start researching and looking at I don't know what I'm going to be looking at. I'm going to be looking for some theme that will coalesce. But this is sort of normal. I don't usually, it's like I finish a series and then it's like, oh no, now what am I going to do? So it's scary, but then it's also kind of exciting because it's like, it all opens up again and I get to pick whatever I want. As long as it's good.
Thank you so much for talking with us. This is terrific. Thank you.
You're very welcome. That I've for many years used elements of male-female relationships.
Absolutely.
And sex and gender and the body.
Yes.
And then I think key within all of this is the element of desire.
Desire.
And rock and roll is, the person on stage is a vessel of desire.
Aha. A lot of your work, well, each series is based on historical literary references, essentially.
Yeah, yeah.
For example, one series is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It was a jumping off point. Is that what the texts are? Are they jumping off points? Do they serve as an analog to content, or both?
Actually both, but I think with my work I've always started from very laid out, and I do a lot of research and a lot of reading before I do anything.
Does language then function as a semiological? Is it linguistic interpretation, or it's symbolic meaning? A phrase or a title has symbolic meaning that resonates for you?
It's actually both, and it's also when I pick text as a source, I usually will pick text that most people have a reference to. They already have a thought about what it is. So it's rare that I will, pick some really obscure text.
Yeah. We are talking today with Carole Caroompas, longtime Los Angeles-based painter, performance artist, and art educator. Carole, tell us about rock and roll. What does it represent to you both as a working material and as subject matter?
I think thematically, it's like I love going to concerts. I love music, and not just rock and roll music. I sort of cross over into eclectic stuff too.
Uh-huh.
But I think where it sort of enters into my work is, but then again, you know, like someone like Virginia Woolf, I'm assuming that one knows who Virginia Woolf is. So, you know, then there's also like, I did a series of fairy tales.
Right.
And everyone, you know, has some kind of like contact with a fairy tale and what Little Red Riding Hood means.
Sure.
Frankenstein, I think, is sort of the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I did another series of Hester and Zorro in Quest of a New World. Hester being the Scarlet Letter, which most people know.
Right.
And Zorro, everybody knows. And then, you know, Wuthering Heights is pretty well known. Also, a lot of these, a lot of the things that I pick have also been a language base.
Mm.
So, whatever subject I've sort of chosen to work with, and the sort of overall theme or title of the series, from there I usually come up with all the titles of the work. And then I only work on one piece at a time, and then I bounce off of that title. So
the title is always previous to the...
Language always has been.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's hugely interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
And then the images are chosen in terms of how the language directs them towards the content, which a lot of artists don't do that. They start from the visuals, or they start from like instinct, or it's